history is ugly. If the only thing that we want to remember is the good stuff, then we're missing the whole point of even talking about history. I've always been interested in history, whether it's my family's history, history of the state of North Carolina, and now even the history of these stadiums. Thinking about Joe McNeely and him being lynched inside of what is currently Bank of America Stadium, thinking about what happened at Clemson and that part of the stadium is actually built on this burial ground, thinking about Lincolnville, a community that was here and now is where Carter Finley Stadium and PNC Arena currently is. I learned that William Rand Kenan, the person who Kenan Stadium is named after, was a part of a brigade of men who helped to kill a bunch of black folks in Wilmington in 1898. And then the light bulb kind of went off for me at that moment. Like, wow, like this stadium bears the name of a white supremacist who wanted to and openly killed black people here in the state of North Carolina. And yet every Saturday, there are black men who are on that field looking to create a future for themselves. And I said, there's something there. And I have to figure out where they're all connected, but there's something there, and that's the story that we need to tell.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and sit down.
All right, let's do it.
Ready?
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Chris, let's have you look into the camera and then just say your first and last name and who you are.
Hi, I'm Chris Lee. I'm a WRAL sports anchor and reporter. I'm from North Carolina. My last name, Lee, is directly from a plantation in Caswell County. Leesburg, the county seat, is where my last name even comes from. We are in Leesburg, North Carolina. This is in Caswell County. I mean, the last name came from the Lee family who owned enslaved people here in Caswell County. So the Lees were big in this community. And so my family was owned by the Lee family, and now the last name has been passed on. So I've always wanted to know about the history and how things kind of came about. People died at these sites. You know, some of these universities were built by former enslaved people, and these stadiums were built on top of their graves. There are people who lived real lives there, and we don't know who they are, and we should know who they are. And so right now, they're just ghosts. And if we discover more about their history and understand how it connects to today, then maybe we can move forward.
Tell me, when you started looking at these other stadiums, what went through your mind?
So part of it came from reading David Zucchino's book, Wilmington's Lie.
My name's David Zucchino. I'm the author of Wilmington's Lie, which documents the coup of 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. I decided to write the book because I thought the entire country should know about this momentous event in history that really changed the face of the South and brought white supremacy back to the fore. I mean, this was the triggering event.
So reading that book, I learned that William Rand Kenan, the person who Kenan Stadium is named after, was a part of a brigade of men who helped to kill a bunch of black folks in Wilmington in 1898.
One of the problems with William Rand Kenan's memory is that the most consequential thing that he ever did has been the very thing that's been left out. My name is William Sturkey, and I am an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. William Rand Kenan is a lot of different things. He is also the son of a wealthy slave-owning family. He is a Civil War veteran who fought for the Confederacy, and he is a man who helped overthrow black political power in the state using violence and murdering a couple dozen African Americans in Wilmington in 1898.
Wilmington was probably the most integrated city in the South, the most integrated big city at least, and black men had really carved out successful lives after the Civil War. There was a really strong working class and a black middle class. White Republicans had teamed up with black men who had earned the vote after the Civil War and actually outnumbered whites in Wilmington, and they had managed to take over the city council. They appointed a number of black men to administrative posts, as magistrates, as postmasters, and this just infuriated the white supremacists who were accustomed to leading Wilmington. So they laid a plan in the summer and fall of 1898 to wait until the midterm elections in November and then mount a coup, overthrow the government, and as a pretext, they created a cover story in which they said that black men were stockpiling weapons and planning a takeover of the whole city, and were going to murder white men and women and children, which was completely false. Josephus Daniels was the editor and publisher of the News and Observer in Raleigh, and he had a central role in the propaganda campaign of 1898, which was designed to incite white violence against black men with the goal of driving black men from public and elected office and keeping them away from the polls forever. He was extremely successful. They planted phony stories throughout the state, and the News and Observer was the most dominant newspaper in the state. It was the biggest paper and the most influential. At least almost 25% of white voters were illiterate, so Josephus Daniels hired an editorial cartoonist to draw cartoons depicting black men as savages and as rapists, and that was to reach part of the white voting bloc that couldn't read, but they could certainly understand these editorial cartoons, which were pretty horrible. And the coup was successful. First of all, they stole the 1898 election by stuffing ballot boxes and intimidating and beating black men and keeping them from voting. And then 2 days later, they mounted this coup which overthrew municipal government. It was a coup. It was basically a massacre of black people at the hands of well-armed white supremacists, and it was planned well in advance. It wasn't a spontaneous, quote, race riot. It was a well-planned, well-conceived, and well-executed coup to overthrow multiracial government in Wilmington. William Rand Kenan Sr., known as Buck, Kenan himself was commander of a gun wagon. The merchants of Wilmington, the white merchants, had bought what they called a rapid-fire gun. It was basically an early machine gun that fired 420 rounds a minute, and they mounted it on a wagon drawn by a horse, and they used it during the coup to kill black men and intimidate black men. They rolled it through the streets during the day, and Kenan was the captain. There was one incident at an intersection, according to the records I found, where the gun crew opened up on a crowd of black men that had gathered there and killed an estimated 25 people. There was another incident in which they fired into a building in which 3 black men were later found dead. It's really impossible to know how many black men were killed that day. Some men, after they were shot, crawled under houses and died there, so not all the bodies were recovered. Basically, historians estimate at least 60 black men were killed, and there have been estimates of over 100 people killed that day. The coup was celebrated openly in the white-run newspapers. There were celebrations in Raleigh afterwards. It was seen as this momentous event that brought white men back into positions of power, which was the way in their mind that things should be, and completely eliminated black men from voting and from politics.
Even though the men who committed the Wilmington Massacre and all those atrocities were quite proud of that in the moment, the next generation, when writing about it, sort of softened it and said, well, you know, there were all these problems with African Americans and they had to be dealt with. And even William Rand Kenan Jr. cast a shadow of doubt on whether or not his father was even there in the first place. But of course, we have the picture of him on the wagon with the gun.
What do you know of the story behind how this stadium ended up being named after his father?
So William Rand Kenan Jr., when he donated the money, said that he'd like for the stadium to be named for his father. And of course, the university agreed because one of its major benefactors, perhaps its most important benefactor, both in the past and in the future, they want to keep him happy, wanted that name for the stadium. And so the university agreed to go ahead and honor that. I think it's important to realize that William Rand Kenan Jr., when he named the stadium after his father, never imagined that black people would be playing there. Just completely unbelievable to him. And so when the university desegregated a generation later, and of course when more African Americans began to play football for UNC Chapel Hill, this huge problem emerged that the stadium's named after a person that did a lot of things in their life, but one of those things was murder a couple dozen black people. But of course, that was all swept under the rug for a long time. All of the information documenting all of this is in the archives, just a few steps away from the stadium itself. What had happened was that the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 has not been taught well in this state. It was covered up for almost a century by some of the people that perpetrated the violence and certainly by their ancestors. And it's just not something that people ever wanted to talk about because it made some of those early white benefactors of UNC Chapel Hill and of the state look quite uncivilized and violent, barbaric even. In 2018, an NBC sports writer produced a story about the namesake of Kenan Stadium and connecting that namesake to his role in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. The Daily Tar Heel, had this sort of explosive cover story about it. And at the time, the university had a moratorium against renaming buildings. So it couldn't rename the building because its own board of trustees has said, well, we can't rename any more buildings for over a dozen years from this point. In response to that, the university sort of panicked because it had to do something because that was looking really bad in terms of publicity, especially with young black recruits, and decided to rededicate the stadium from the father to the son. And it was a big news story for just a few weeks there, I think, and then it just sort of fizzled out.
There should be some marker or a plaque that gives the entire background and the whole history of the naming and why the name was changed and what the son did in life and what the father did and how that was different. I really think some explanation is needed. Otherwise, in a few years, people will just walk by and say, well, there's Kenan Stadium. They will have no idea what the history was.
I think that one of the things that the university has done is to try and remove all controversy. I don't think that necessarily helps anybody. I think it's actually harder to keep a name and teach the real history than it is just to change the name and take down the plaques. We've never had a truly open conversation about the history of race regarding Kenan Stadium or anywhere else on this campus. I think we study history not for the past, we study it for the future. And I think the question that we should not ask is, how does this make me feel? But what's the best way to craft a better society for our children?
A mob of 30 to 35 white men invade the hospital, take him out of the hospital, drag him into the street, and shoot him to death in the street in front of the hospital. All of this takes place on what is now the site of the Bank of America Stadium.
Bank of America Stadium and that surrounding area was a black neighborhood in Charlotte. That actual site was the Good Samaritan Hospital, which was the segregated hospital. And in 1913, there was a lynching that took place where the field currently stands.
And this is an important part of what the past was actually like. What sort of led to the society we have now, in good ways and bad. My name is Dan Aldridge. I am professor of history and Africana studies at Davidson College. The hospital is the most notable thing on the site of the Bank of America Stadium. Good Samaritan Hospital was the first private hospital built in North Carolina to serve black patients. So at the one hand, it's a symbol of some sort of black achievement and pride. We have a hospital, but it's also emblematic of racial health disparities and of just the profound inequality in what you're provided. It's a symbol of both shame and pride. And for just having, a neighborhood of your own. What's a tragedy is so many stadia were built on sites that were once black communities. They're poor neighborhoods, they're struggling neighborhoods. I won't romanticize them by claiming they're all a thing called a Black Wall Street or something like that. But they were people's homes and people's communities, they were taken from them.
Many people believe when they think about lynchings, they think about individuals that are hanging from trees. That is one form of lynching. But lynching also includes what happened to Mr. Joe McNeely. I'm Krista Terrell. I'm a member of the steering committee for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Remembrance Project. So Mr. Joe McNeely was a 22-year-old black man. He was a laborer and lived right here in Charlotte. He was actually got into an altercation with a white police officer. Gunshots were fired.
He was accused of shooting and wounding a police officer in the line of duty. He is arrested. He's injured. He himself is shot during the incident.
And Mr. McNeely was held at the Good Samaritan Hospital. He was not a patient there. He was chained to his bed and was guarded by 2 police officers.
A mob of 30 to 35 white men invade the hospital, take him out of the hospital, drag him into the street, and shoot him to death in the street in front of the hospital. All of this takes place on what is now the site of the Bank of America Stadium.
There were a group of jurors who deliberated for 3 days, but in the end, they indicted no one, named no one, and no one was ever held accountable for the lynching of Mr. Joe McNeely.
I don't think you can't tear down the stadium because of it, but you should acknowledge what happened on the site and in the presence of Good Samaritan Hospital and this whole black community.
It's kind of haunting to think about that and how over time that land, which was a thriving community called Brooklyn in Charlotte, was eventually taken away.
The exploitation of the poor and powerless is something that doesn't shock you if you read history.
Thinking about Lincolnville, a community that was here and now is where Carter Finley Stadium and PNC Arena currently is.
Why are those lands okay to build on, to create entertainment spaces on? I'm Carmen Wimberly Cawthon. I'm considered a local historian, and I've written a book called Historical Black Neighborhoods of Raleigh. When the war ended, slavery ended, and African Americans were free for the first time. People came from all parts of the state of North Carolina to Raleigh because it was the capital city. There were several communities that we call freedmen's villages that were created around the city limits. Lincolnville was one of those communities. They would build a church, they would have a pastor, and that is still true today. Lincolnville AME Church started here, and the community of Lincolnville grew around that area. The land in Lincolnville was sold to the state, and the people were told that the prison would be here. And then they changed and didn't build a prison, and they built a football stadium years later.
So this is one of the cemeteries here at Lincolnville, steps from Carter Finley Stadium and then PNC Arena. I've driven by here so many different times and just did not realize this was here at all.
This is not the only cemetery in this area. This is one of 2.
We are told that a cemetery was coming from NC State to expand the Carter Finley complex. My name is Robin Simonton. I'm the executive director here at Historic Oakwood Cemetery. A university being the client of the relocated cemetery was a little different for us, I must say. But when they arrive here, they are in pine boxes, maybe 20 by 20 inches square. We put them back in that same order they were in their original cemetery. It wasn't until about a year later that a family member from one of these families came in and said, hey, I think my loved one was in that relocated cemetery.
What is the name?
Emmeline White. She died in 1922, I believe. She was in Lincolnville. She was an enslaved woman. It made us that much more motivated to find out as much about her as possible, why we went through the census records and tried to do her genealogy. So we could tell her story. And while we don't know all 12 of their names, she becomes then representative of this community of 12 people that are here. But she is somebody that every time I walk down this road with the family giving a tour, we do point her out. Because I think now more than ever, we all know as a community that these stories of the formerly enslaved are often lost, and it's our obligation to try to tell them.
It was not treated as a cemetery. It was treated as a funding resource for athletics. It was also treated as a place to party.
The Clemson game. Tell me why you were there and what you saw.
So NC State was down at Clemson the year before. NC State beat Clemson in this spectacular double overtime game at Carter Finley Stadium. And so the next year we knew we had to go down to Clemson for that game to see what would happen. And as I was walking into the media side, the media entrance of the stadium, I just happened to look to my right, and there was a small placard that showed that this was a land with burials from former enslaved people. Right here next to the stadium. So I simply took out my phone, did a little story and panned over. It showed how close the stadium was to that land. And I found out that the school had just publicly acknowledged what that land was in 2021, the year before I was actually there.
People kind of saw the cemetery more as a park rather than a cemetery. My name is Rhonda Robinson Thomas, and I am the Calhoun Lemon Professor of Literature at Clemson University. Clemson allowed parking within the cemetery. It was not treated as a cemetery. It was treated as a funding resource for athletics. It was also treated as a place to party before the games. So a decision was made to survey the entire cemetery. Over 500 anomalies believed to be unmarked burials were found throughout the entire cemetery. Our research suggests that those unmarked burials are those of enslaved people and sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And so they decided to provide the resources that we needed to actually document the history of the cemetery for the first time. They decided to beautify the cemetery by putting in new pathways that would really signal to the world that this is a sacred site.
There is a place that is acknowledging their past. What about the people who toiled on this land? What about the people who helped build this university? Their stories are just as important. They need to be told as well.
And none of us did these things. That's the thing that's sometimes so hard to grapple with. There's a real immaturity, I think, in saying, well, another white person 100 years ago, did something, and that makes me feel bad. It's not about that. It's not about assigning guilt to anybody today.
History is not going to always make you feel good, but one of the things we can do is learn from our history and set up a better tomorrow for our kids.
And it makes you wonder how much of America, the parts that we prize the most, were not only built on the backs of the people who built them, literally were built on their graves, on the places where they died.